The day of moving into our new house promised to be simple, even routine, but everything went differently than expected. Our car, loaded with boxes and bags, stopped 100 meters from the house. I tried to start the engine, but it only made an irritating buzzing sound, as if mocking our situation. Mark, my husband, angrily tapped the steering wheel, while I stepped out of the car and gazed at the suddenly silent street, illuminated by the slanting rays of the evening sun. The roar of a motorcycle engine pierced the silence like thunder before a storm. Luke, Mark's younger brother, pulled up to us, removing his helmet with a slight smirk on his face. His rebellious energy always set him apart, and in this moment, it felt like salvation. "Your old clunker let you down again?" he teased, lifting one of the boxes as if it weighed nothing. I couldn't help but smile. Luke always had a knack for showing up when things seemed at their worst. "Easy to laugh when you don't even own a car," Mark grumbled. Instead of prolonging the argument, we got to work carrying the belongings to the house. Luke, never one for wasting time on unnecessary chatter, was already unloading his motorcycle, offering to keep me company. Exhausted but satisfied, we finally stepped into the new house. Spacious, with high ceilings and large windows that cast long shadows on the floor. "So, shall we start unpacking?" Mark asked, but instead of replying, I opened a box of plates and suggested an impromptu picnic. We spread out blankets, lit candles, and settled right there on the floor. Mark and Luke laughed, reminiscing about family stories, while I watched their faces, feeling something important stir to life in the house. The sense of a beginning, undefined but exhilarating. This moment, seemingly simple and unremarkable, stayed in my memory as the first brushstroke on a canvas we were yet to paint. The morning began with me standing amidst boxes, unsure of where to start. My plan was simple: unpack everything and make the house livable as quickly as possible. But as soon as Luke peeked in through the door with a cup of coffee, the usual course of events changed. "Trying to do everything at once?" he asked, casting a lazy smile as he looked around the chaos. "Well, how else? We need everything to be in its place," I replied, not taking my eyes off the box of dishes. "You know, that's boring," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Let's do something instead. Let's go to the flea market. We'll definitely find something that gives the house a soul." I wanted to refuse. For a second, I even thought about saying that I already had plenty to do, but there was something enticing about his suggestion. The thought of antique items, of random finds that could tell stories, made me agree. The market turned out to be a labyrinth of stalls, where everything, from worn-out books to ornate candle holders, looked as though it had lived through someone's vibrant life. Luke moved between the stalls with effortless confidence, as if it were his second home. "Look over here," he called, stopping by a bulky cabinet with mirrored doors. Its frame was intricately carved, with wood darkened by time, seemingly whispering of bygone eras. "Now this is a real treasure." "It's too old and bulky," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Old? It's antique," Luke smirked, touching the patterns on the door. "And bulky doesn't mean bad. This cabinet will become your symbol, furniture with character." We argued for a long time, but in the end, the cabinet came with us. Upon returning home, a true saga began. Assembling it was more challenging than I had anticipated. Every detail, every fastening required attention, and Luke, with his characteristic meticulousness, took his time. "So, can you handle this test?" he joked, twirling a screwdriver in his hand. I couldn't help but laugh, but I was grateful for his patience. He noticed little things I would have overlooked, and his confidence somehow rubbed off on me. When the cabinet finally stood in its place, I stepped back and looked at it. It was truly beautiful. "Well, now this is your home," Luke said, wiping his hands and smiling as if he had just performed a miracle. I felt a warm wave of gratitude. There was something more in his words than just a comment. It was a moment that, as I later realized, marked the beginning of something new and complex. In the evening, after a long day dealing with furniture and boxes, Mark suggested going bowling. His idea seemed like it could restore our normal routine, but Luke unexpectedly intervened. What if instead we cook something? Real food, not boxed pizza? He suggested, looking at me with a challenging interest. Can you cook? I asked, trying to hide a slight confusion. Let's find out, he threw, and there was a challenge in his tone. The three of us ended up in the kitchen, but Mark quickly lost interest in the process and went to check how the internet was working. Luke, left with me, began laying out the ingredients. Strange spices I had never seen before, bright vegetables with an exotic scent. Is this a family recipe? I asked, watching as he skillfully cut the ginger. More of an experiment. I saw it at a cafe in Berlin and decided to try to recreate it, he said, glancing at me with a sly squint. The main thing is not to be afraid to get messy. This turned out to be prophetic. A few minutes later, as I was stirring the sauce, I somehow managed to spill it onto the stove. Luke laughed so sincerely that I couldn't help but smile. That's why I don't trust you with sharp knives, he said, cleaning up after me. We laughed as we tidied the kitchen, like children who had just pulled a prank. His hand accidentally touched mine as he handed me a towel. The touch was fleeting, but I suddenly felt my heart stop for a second. This moment should have faded away, becoming a meaningless episode, but something in the air had changed. I couldn't tell whether it was real or just my imagination. Luke, as if nothing had happened, continued cooking, telling some story about his travels, but I was barely listening to him. When the dish was ready, Mark returned, and the three of us sat down to dinner. Luke was joking, and I tried to bring myself back to reality. But even when the evening ended and everyone dispersed to their rooms, I couldn't stop thinking about that brief touch, about his voice, soft but for some reason unsettling. I stared at the ceiling in the dark, trying to understand exactly what I was feeling. Was it just exhaustion? Or something more, something I didn't want to acknowledge? The next morning, I decided to spend the day outdoors to distract myself. The garden at the house had become overgrown into a wild thicket, and I figured it was time to tidy it up. Luke, as always, appeared unexpectedly, with a cup of coffee and a new idea. "Forget about the bushes," he said, looking at me with a hint of mockery. "There's an abandoned greenhouse nearby. Let's go check it out. Maybe we'll get inspired." I didn't want to agree. My mind was swirling with thoughts of all the unfinished tasks in the house, but Luke's gaze was persistent and, to be honest, I was curious. The greenhouse turned out to be a few minutes' walk from the house, hidden behind dense trees like some secret nook. Broken glass, ivy-clad walls, and old metal frames created a strange yet alluring atmosphere. The place looked as though it had been waiting for someone to breathe life back into it. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Luke asked, standing beside me. His voice sounded quieter than usual, as if he too sensed the special ambiance of the place. "Yes, but why did you bring me here?" I replied, watching as the sunbeams danced on the shards of glass scattered on the floor. "I thought it could become our project. We could restore it, make it a part of the house, a part of your story," he said, looking straight into my eyes. I was about to respond with something light-hearted, but suddenly I felt the tile beneath my foot betrayingly slip. I began to fall, but Luke swiftly grabbed my hand, holding me just a little longer than necessary. "Be careful," he said, his voice softer than usual. I looked at him. There was something in his eyes that made me freeze. It lasted only a moment, but it felt like an eternity. Luke was the first to break the silence, making a joke. "All right, I don't want you to have a guilty conscience." We both laughed, trying to dispel the awkwardness, but the moment left a strange feeling behind. On the way home, I found myself sneaking glances at Luke, and he seemed to be deliberately avoiding my gaze. In the evening, I returned to my chores, but thoughts of the greenhouse and how Luke held my hand lingered. This feeling, strange and unsettling, was growing like a wave that I couldn't stop. Work on the house continued, but the evening lantern festival that Mark suggested organizing became a rare moment when we all took a break from our tasks. Luke embraced the idea with enthusiasm, bringing garlands, lanterns, and even taking on the role of organizer. The greenhouse we had recently inspected became the centerpiece of the evening. Luke and I hung the lanterns together, their soft light filling the space with coziness and warmth. The celebration began after the sun had set, and the greenhouse came alive with the twinkling lights. Music, laughter, and the faint scent of flowers blended into one, creating an atmosphere where it was easy to forget our worries. Later, once most of the lanterns were up, Luke stayed with me to finish the final preparations. His ease and ability to infuse something extraordinary into any task transformed the ordinary into the magical. We stood in the center of the greenhouse admiring our work. "It turned out beautifully," I said, gazing at the glowing lights that seemed to float in the air. "It's all you," Luke replied, turning to face me. I felt his gaze on me but couldn't bring myself to meet his eyes. When I finally dared to lift my eyes, our gazes met. There was something in the silence between us that made it almost unbearable. "I didn't plan for this," Luke said softly. His voice wavered, but he didn't look away. Before I could comprehend what I was doing, I stepped closer. Everything happened so quickly. Our lips met, and for a moment, the entire world vanished. Only the soft glow of the lanterns and this strange yet irresistible connection between us remained. But the moment was fleeting. Luke pulled back as if snapping back to reality faster than I did. His eyes were filled with contradictions, apology and something else he clearly didn't want to admit. "We can't," he began, but then stopped, shaking his head. I tried to say something, but the words got stuck in my throat. We stood in silence until Luke finally turned away, his face shadowed by the lights. "Let's just forget this," he said, clenching and unclenching his fists. His voice was almost a whisper, but I heard every word. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. We both tried to avoid interacting, dodging each other's gazes. Mark didn't notice anything. His laughter and jokes filled the greenhouse, but I felt a fragile and dangerous tension lurking beneath the surface of the celebration. When everything ended and the guests dispersed, I was left alone in the darkness, illuminated only by the last flickers of the lantern lights. I knew that what had happened couldn't be undone, but that thought somehow didn't bring relief. Instead, I felt an emptiness growing inside me. We tried to avoid each other, although in a house full of unpacked boxes and small tasks, it was almost impossible. Mark didn't notice the changes right away, but when he finally began to pay attention to Luke's strange behavior, his evasive answers and sudden absences, he became suspicious. One evening he suggested having a family dinner. "We all need to relax," he said, smiling. But his gaze lingered on Luke a little longer than usual. Mark tried to keep the conversation going, but everything sounded unnatural. Luke barely spoke, only nodding or responding with one-word answers. I tried to focus on the food, but every time I looked up, it was as if Mark unintentionally found Luke. "Luke," Mark suddenly said, setting down his glass of wine. "You've been acting strange lately. Is everything okay?" Luke froze, his fork stopping halfway to his plate. I felt my heart beat faster. "Of course everything is fine," Luke replied, trying to sound casual, but there was a slight tremor in his voice. "Really?" Mark continued, leaning his elbows on the table. "Then why are you avoiding me, or is it just my imagination?" "You're making things up," Luke dismissed, avoiding his gaze. An awkward silence hung over the table after that. Mark turned his gaze to me, his eyes narrowed. "And you? Everything okay?" he asked in a tone that conveyed more doubt than concern. I tried to respond calmly, but my voice betrayed me. "Of course, Mark. Everything is fine." His expression grew colder, but he said nothing more. When dinner ended and we began clearing the table, Mark stopped Luke in the hallway. I accidentally overheard their conversation while standing in the adjacent room. At first, they spoke softly, but Mark's tone became increasingly harsh. "You think I don't see anything?" Mark demanded sharply. "You think I don't notice how you look at her?" "That's not true," Luke replied, his voice firm. "Not true? Then explain why I feel there's something between you two." "I'm not blind, Luke," I couldn't take it anymore and stepped into the hallway. Both turned to me, their faces showing different emotions, Mark's anger and Luke's confusion. "What's going on?" Mark asked, looking directly at me. His voice was cold, almost icy. I tried to respond, but the words got stuck. For the first time in a long while, I didn't know what to say. Instead, I felt everything collapsing right before my eyes. We tried to avoid each other, although in a house full of unpacked boxes and small tasks, it was almost impossible. Mark didn't notice the changes right away, but when he finally began to pay attention to Luke's strange behavior, his evasive answers and sudden absences, he became suspicious. One evening he suggested having a family dinner. "We all need to relax," he said, smiling, but his gaze lingered on Luke a little longer than usual. Mark tried to keep the conversation going, but everything sounded unnatural. Luke barely spoke, only nodding or responding with one-word answers. I tried to focus on the food, but every time I looked up, it was as if Mark unintentionally found Luke. "Luke," Mark suddenly said, setting down his glass of wine, "you've been acting strange lately. Is everything okay?" Luke froze, his fork stopping halfway to his plate. I felt my heart beat faster. "Of course everything is fine," Luke replied, trying to sound casual, but there was a slight tremor in his voice. "Really?" Mark continued, leaning his elbows on the table. "Then why are you avoiding me? Or is it just my imagination?" "You're making things up?" Luke dismissed, avoiding his gaze. An awkward silence hung over the table after that. Mark turned his gaze to me, his eyes narrowed. "And you? Everything okay?" he asked in a tone that conveyed more doubt than concern. I tried to respond calmly, but my voice betrayed me. "Of course, Mark. Everything is fine." His expression grew colder, but he said nothing more. When dinner ended and we began clearing the table, Mark stopped Luke in the hallway. I accidentally overheard their conversation while standing in the adjacent room. At first, they spoke softly, but Mark's tone became increasingly harsh. "You think I don't see anything?" Mark demanded sharply. "You think I don't notice how you look at her?" "That's not true," Luke replied, his voice firm. "Not true? Then explain why I feel there's something between you two." "I'm not blind, Luke." I couldn't take it anymore and stepped into the hallway. Both turned to me, their faces showing different emotions, Mark's anger and Luke's confusion. "What's going on?" Mark asked, looking directly at me. His voice was cold, almost icy. I tried to respond, but the words got stuck. For the first time in a long while, I didn't know what to say. Instead, I felt everything collapsing right before my eyes. After the hallway scene, an overwhelming silence ensued. Luke left without saying a word, leaving me alone with Mark. His gaze burned through me, filled with too many emotions: anger, pain, disappointment. He was waiting for explanations, and I couldn't say anything. "Are you going to say something?" he finally asked, his voice quiet but only making it scarier. I took a deep breath, gathering the last remnants of my courage. "It was a mistake." My words sounded so weak that I almost couldn't believe I had uttered them. "It means nothing, Mark." He laughed, but his laughter was cold, without a trace of joy. "Nothing? You say that as if I didn't see anything." He stepped closer and I involuntarily took a step back. "Your glances, how you avoid each other, as if it couldn't be any more obvious." "It was just once," I said, feeling my voice tremble. "It was a moment. Just an impulse." Mark fell silent, looking at me as if I had said something outrageous. He ran his hand over his face, trying to calm himself, but I could see a storm raging inside him. "So you admit it," he finally said. "You admit that something happened." "It was a mistake, Mark," I repeated, almost pleading. "I don't know how it happened. It was stupid." "Stupid?" he questioned again, his voice becoming quieter but more dangerous. "Then why can't I get out of my head how you two looked at each other? Why do I feel like I lost you long before this mistake?" His words pierced me like a knife. I realized I could no longer deny that something had truly changed, something I hadn't even realized myself. Luke didn't return to the house that night. In the morning, I found his note on the kitchen table. "I can't stay. I was wrong, and my guilt is too great. I hope you can fix this without me. I'm sorry for being the cause of your pain. Luke." I stood holding the note while Mark appeared in the doorway. He looked at me without saying a word. His silence was even heavier than his anger. "He left," I said quietly, showing him the note. Mark silently sat down at the table, his head in his hands. I didn't know what to say or do to restore what had been broken. All that remained was silence, filled with regret. That same night we talked for a long time. Mark asked questions that I tried to answer honestly. He wanted to know why it happened, how it started. But I couldn't give him answers that would explain or soothe anything. "I can't just forget this," he said at the end. "I don't know if I can forgive, but I know we need time." Those words sounded like a final verdict. I realized that it was the end of one chapter of our lives, but where we would go next, only time and fate knew.